Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 287 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. It's not a stretch to say that the Tudors are some of the most popular figures in all of history. The stars of countless nonfiction books, novels, TV shows, podcasts, and even video games, Elizabeth I and her father Henry VIII are seemingly endless sources of fascination. Strangely, the founder of the dynasty, Henry VII, is often left behind in the excitement of Tudor mania. Though he's remembered as the man who united the two dynastic royal houses of England, Henry was more than just the Red Rose of Lancaster. He was also the Red Dragon of Wales. This week, I spoke with Nathen Amin about Henry Tudor and his Welsh roots. Nathen is the media's go-to guy on the life of Henry VII, appearing on History Hit, BBC4, and a whole lot of podcasts. He's also the author of several books on Henry, including The House of Beaufort, The Bastard Line That Captured the Crown, and Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders, Simnel, Warbeck, and Warwick. His new book is Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. Our conversation on why it's important to understand Henry's Welsh ancestry, how generations of royals and rebels shaped him, and how he managed to claim the English throne despite desperately long odds, is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Nathen, to talk about Henry Tudor. It is so nice to meet you. We have known of each other for the longest time, and now we are finally meeting. Welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. Whenever somebody invites me to discuss all things Henry Tudor, I'm always happy to engage, and I'm particularly happy to engage with you on this podcast because, as you say, we've known of each other for quite a while. I've followed your podcast, I've followed your work, so hello.
Hello. Okay, so we are going to be talking about your latest work, Son of Prophecy, and this is all about Henry Tudor's roots in Wales. But first, I need to ask you, as I asked David Carpenter, who also liked a Henry that doesn't get a lot of love, why Henry Tudor? Why does he speak to you?
I guess we need to go back to my personal journey in a little way, in that I am born and bred in West Wales, and I've always had an interest in history, but I didn't study history to any significant educational level in school. Unfortunately, at 15 years old, I was forced to choose between history and geography, and my school made me take geography, which has been a bone of contention ever since. But my history got reawakened in me when I was in my 20s, and I was very interested in Welsh history, because where I am from in West Wales, we are surrounded by all types of history. You can't leave your front door without getting bombarded with all matters of Welsh history and Welsh folklore and Welsh mythology. But I'm also quite a hyperactive person, and I do have many eclectic interests, some of which have included the American Mafia, the civil rights movement, and briefly, Henry VIII. So I was reading some Henry VIII books in my mid-20s and around 2009, and I very quickly got quite bored of the whole Six Wives drama. Sorry to any fans of Anne Boleyn listening out there, but it bored me quite quick. I do joke I am toxic masculinity in human form. You know, I love boxing, I love rugby, I love all those kind of, crash and hit kind of escapades. So briefly, at the start of every one of these Henry VIII books was a very minor mention of some Welsh chap from where I am from in West Wales who won his crown in battle. And this fascinated me. Who was this guy, Henry Tudor, born in my backyard, who rose up to become a king of England? And I started to try and do a bit more reading and research around him. Now, 2009, the most recent book that had been written was 1997, an academic thesis by Sean Cunningham, legend. And before that, a very dry but detailed exploration of Henry VII, written in 1972 by a guy called S.B. Crimes. There was nothing out there for the mass market. There was nothing out there for a beginner to get into Henry VII. So I started to do my own research, and gradually, as a journalism graduate, I started to put together a blog. And it just snowballed from there. Henry VII, I think the 21st century, certainly since 2010, has been the decade of Henry VII when we talk of the Tudor monarchs. He's really risen to the fore. Part of that coincides, of course, with the discovery of a certain king under a car park, who we won't mention, or maybe we'll mention later.
We'll mention later.
I was able to be at the forefront, not myself, but part of it, trying to discover Henry VII. So it's a circuitous route. But the bottom line is, if you ask me quickly in one sentence why, he's simply a very interesting Welshman from where I am back home. And that is enough. That is the single opening door to kick it down and learn more.
Well, I mean, you always have to start somewhere. And I've said again and again on this podcast, it starts with interest. And what I love about the research that's happening right now is so many historians are like, here's where it started for me. It was my interest. And nobody is quite as embarrassed about it like they used to be back in the day. So I love it. You're picking someone who speaks to you, who resonates with you. So why do you think Henry hasn't had much love to this point?
The Victorians. I think we historians like to blame the Victorians for a lot of things. But with Henry VII, first and foremost, he comes across, or historically, his historiography comes across that he's a dour accountant king, a boring miser who is nothing more than the dull bridge between the exciting Plantagenets that came before and the Renaissance that flowered under Henry VIII. That's at least the perception that has come down to us. And it has been furthered by Victorian studies. Now, Henry VII seems to have been quite a popular king with the Whig historians, to whom we owe a debt of gratitude in many ways for their industrious research, but they have left us with a lingering legacy that modern historians are now trying to unpick. And I think for them, Henry VII was very popular because they really respected his administrative prowess. They respected his constitutional progressions. They respected his financial policies. Basically, all the boring things. They really admired the political tenure of his reign. So first and foremost, that is what they examined, and that's what they highlighted. They completely pushed to the side the personal aspects of his life and his reign, which is good because that's the kind of thing I'm now making my name on, bringing to the fore. And secondly, this also comes down to his kind of unique Anglo-Welsh background, which again is something that I now study. The Victorians were writing during an age of empire and particularly English exceptionalism. So this king that they deeply admired, it didn't do well for them that he was Welsh, and I would argue had a very Welsh bearing and a very Welsh upbringing. The evidence is there if people are bothered to look of Henry VII's Welshness. And they've removed that. So that's been removed in this reinterpretation that they've passed down of Henry VII that has then influenced the consequential generation of historians. So his greatest biographer, at least until now, I'd like to say, is S.B. Grimes, who wrote in 1972 a book on Henry VII. And he is a student of that Victorian school. So he himself is furthering those ideas. And his book still remains to this day almost the gold standard of study. Thomas Penn in 2012 wrote The Winter King and again chose to focus on quite a negative interpretation of Henry VII. So, he's fallen between the cracks a little bit. And I think he has been quite misunderstood. I wouldn't say he's been maligned like a Richard III perhaps has, but he definitely has been misinterpreted and only a small sliver of his story has been told. And I think that's quite a shame. Now, just to finish the point quickly, if in England his Welshness has been removed, in Wales, it's quite an interesting dynamic taking place. That in Wales we have essentially two schools. We have English-speaking Wales and we have Welsh-speaking Wales. In English-speaking Wales, a lot of the ills that have befallen Wales over the last couple of centuries, blame for that is often incorrectly placed at the feet of the Tudors. So there are many people within Wales who, if they are even aware of their history, they do not like the Tudors. They view them as traitors to Wales, and they have a very incorrect reading of their past, which is not unique to Wales. England, America, I dare say Canada probably, people misread their history, don't they, for their own modern political ideologies. In Welsh-speaking Wales, these historians have always known the deep legacy and connection the Tudor family had with their country, with the land of their fathers. But of course, you need to be speaking Welsh to be exposed and to have access to their history. So I think he's a king who falls between the cracks. He suffers from being the king who comes in between the two greatest and infamous villains of English history. And I use villains there as in the popular imagination, not necessarily myself, but he falls in between Richard III and Henry VIII. And that's a struggle to get any sunlight as well. So it's all of these things that, unfortunately, he has suffered. But again, well, it's worked well for me.
And that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Well, I mean, he hasn't got a lot of love, so it's time. It's time for you to come forward and start talking about Henry Tudor, which is why I'm grateful to have you on the podcast. Okay, so Henry Tudor doesn't come to the English throne because of his Welsh blood. He comes to it because of his Lancastrian blood, which maybe we can get to in a minute, but I think this is something easy for people to find. But it's not easy to find his Welsh history until you read your book. So tell us a little bit about that Welsh history that backs up Henry. It gives him, I think, a lot of confidence, despite the fact that it is a little bit spicy at times. Tell us why you went all the way back to the time of King John when you're starting to talk about Henry Tudor's Welsh background.
Yeah, I mean, when Henry Tudor becomes King Henry VII of England, one of the first things he does is he launches an investigation to explore his Welsh background. And he does this because he wants to, in his words, counter slanderous assertions that have been made about the quality of his background. And these slanderous assertions, I mean, they come from the mind and the pen of Richard III. Because in the propaganda war, before they meet at Bosworth, Richard III is really doing a number on Henry's Welsh background. Now, Henry wants to explore this, and I'm glad he did, because the investigation that he commissioned gave me a lot of the bones for my own work over the last 10 years. And the investigation reveals that Henry was descended from some of the most ancient and revered kings of Wales there have been. We can go back to the 7th and 8th century. I'm thinking of men like Rhodri y Mawr, Rhodri the Great, and Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good. These are revered ancient Welsh kings. Also descended from King Cadwaladr, who is regarded as the last king of the Britons. And ultimately, this is a bit more fanciful, but it claims that Henry was descended from King Arthur and all the way back to Brutus, who is the mythological founder of Britain. But the point is, Henry has this deep and abiding connection with ancient Welsh royalty. In more recent generations, it is clear he's descended from a long line of Welsh rebels, Welshmen who have proven a thorn in the side of English kings. And I begin my story ultimately with a guy called Ednyfed Vychan, who lived during the late 12th century. And he is someone who we can understand in today's parlance to be something of a prime minister to the last independent kingdom, Welsh kingdom, that was still standing on its 2 feet. And that is Gwynedd, in the north and west of what is now Wales. I always say the English and England fell to the Normans in a matter of weeks after the conquest in 1066. The Welsh held out for nearly 300 years, so come on, the Welsh. But in 1282, finally, Gwynedd does fall. Now, with Nathen Amin, he's a fascinating character because he is very skilled in military warfare. He earns the nickname the Terror of England when he goes across to Chester and he comes back with 3 English heads. And for that, he earns the nickname the Terror of England. So he's obviously a capable military man, but he's also skilled in diplomacy. You know, he is one of the men who is constantly meeting with people like King John to put forward the case for Wales. And Nathen Amin was involved in the sealing of Magna Carta. You know, he was there representing the Welsh interests. And this is the guy who, what we would call later the Tudors, is descended from. And each one of his descendants who go on to live in Wales under English conquest, under English rule, they do their best to try and get on under English rule, but times are very hard for the Welsh in the 14th and 15th centuries. And these men, these, again, for lack of a better term, we'll call them the Tudors, the Welsh Tudors, they are at times raising their head above the parapet and proving troublesome for English kings because they are a family with great influence and power amongst their people. They may not have any offices of note or any tangible power because that is deprived from the Welsh during this period, but they definitely have influence amongst their people. People look to them as almost tribal leaders of the Welsh. And this is the inheritance that gradually comes down through the ages to Henry Tudor. The Welsh knew exactly his lineage. It was very famously said by Gerald of Wales that, I don't know what we would call him, a Welsh Norman cleric who lived in the 12th century. He made it known that the Welsh valued their pedigree more than anything. The Welsh didn't value land, titles, money. They valued their pedigree. And every Welshman could apparently recite their family tree going back at least 8 generations. And this was helped, of course, because the Welsh used patronymics. So, you know, whereas the English gradually assumed surnames, the Welsh were known as, you know, let's take Owen Tudor as an example. Owen Tudor is an English name that's been ascribed to him, but his true name would have been Owain ap means son of, Owain ap Meredydd ap Tudur ap Goronwy ap Tudur ap Goronwy ap Tudur ap Ednyfed ap Cynwyd. So the Welsh had all of these type of names, the son of, the son of, the son of. And again, that's what they respected. So by the time we get Henry Tudor, born, as you say, half English in Pembroke, through birth, half English, a quarter Welsh and a quarter French, that Welsh aspect to him is deeply known by the people around him and by the people of Wales. They know his lineage. Nothing else matters when it comes to evaluating Henry Tudor. And as he grew up, he himself would have become aware of that. And history has told us that Henry was able to exploit this Welshness. And that's a term that's quite negative. Exploits this for his own ends. I think you've touched on something interesting there in that who is to say that Henry didn't buy into this aspect of his Welshness and was able to use it to galvanise support around him, but also something that gave him confidence to press ahead with the mission ahead of him. Maybe he truly believed some of the virtues that were being extolled to him about his Welshness. Maybe he believed some of the folklore that was now being ascribed to him as a descendant of all of these ancient kings. Because the one thing about Henry Tudor we can say is when he becomes King of England, he does not drop the Welsh Act. He keeps it going throughout his reign.
Well, I think that this is something that he would not be able to help but be aware of. The place where he grew up, it's going to be all around him. And then I think that maybe when we're starting to get into Henry's life, so that we can actually fit it into one podcast, maybe we should start with Owen Tudor, because this is somebody who not only is very important to Henry's background, but also somebody who was kind of penalized, it seems to me, for being Welsh at a time when he was maybe overstepping what people thought even an Englishman should do. So let's start with Owen Tudor. Give us the broad strokes about what this guy was all about.
I mean, Owen Tudor is a remarkable figure, and I think we could probably do an entire podcast series about him alone. And he is the figure who really shifts the family story out of Wales and into England in the first place. You see, in 1400, the Welsh had finally had enough of being treated like second-class citizens in their own country. And a first cousin of the Tudors, named Owain Glyndwr, raises the banner of revolt and goes to war with the House of Lancaster to try and free Wales from what he viewed was the shackles of English subjugation. Now, that rebellion collapsed after a decade. They really put the fright on the English crown, but gradually English might prove too much for the Welsh and the revolt collapses. But the aftermath was terrible for the Welsh populace. They were punished collectively, whether they were involved in the revolt or not. You know, that means judicially, militarily, economically. So many young Welshmen had to leave Wales to look for pastures new to make their fortune. And many of these Welshmen ended up in the French armies of Henry V. For young Owen Tudor, he did leave Wales behind, but he didn't make it as far as France. I would suggest possibly because he was too young, and he made it as far as England. We would call him today an economic migrant. He is looking for work outside his homeland. Now, we don't know when and we don't know how, but at some point in England, he finds himself a woman, and she just so happens to be the widowed Queen of England, Catherine of Valois. Owen Tudor marries her in secret. He has multiple children with her, and they do seem to enjoy a life living clandestinely on the fringes of London. The problem for Owen Tudor is that Catherine dies aged just 35, and their marriage is exposed to the King's Council. Owen has broken a law. He's broken a parliamentary law by marrying a widowed Queen of England, and he is summoned to the King's Council to answer for his crime, and he's placed into prison. Now, Owen Tudor is a son, a grandson, and a nephew of Welsh rebels. It doesn't look good for him, but fortunately for him, his stepson happened to be a teenage King of England, Henry VI, and possibly one of the few kings of England who has a streak of mercy and kindness running through his veins. And Henry VI goes against his council's orders to pardon Owen Tudor and embrace him into his royal household. He goes against his council's orders. And from then on, Owen Tudor and his sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, they prove unflinchingly loyal to the cause of Henry VI. What is really interesting is to point out that Henry VI is, of course, of the House of Lancaster. It was Owen's father and his uncles who were at war with the House of Lancaster in 1400. By the 1440s and 1450s, those Tudors are now, well, they're part of the House of Lancaster. It's a remarkable turnaround and something quite unlike anything, I think, in English or Welsh history. This Welsh rebel rising out of Wales and finding himself a queen. I mean, that's some Welsh charm Owen must have had.
Absolutely. I think so. If you are a French queen and you just come across this handsome Welshman, I mean, who's going to resist that? But then this is the moment where the Tudors get even more enmeshed with the Lancastrians, because this is the moment where Margaret Beaufort enters, right? Enter Margaret. Tell us what happens and how this begins to really be the bloodline that brings Henry to the throne.
Yeah, so Henry VI wants to look after his half-brothers, and he in fact inducts them into the English peerage. They become the first Welsh-blooded people brought into the English peerage when they're given the earldoms of Richmond and Pembroke. In Edmund's case, he is given, as you say, a bride of English royal descent in Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort is the wealthiest English heiress of her day. Now, Edmund Tudor very quickly impregnates Margaret, and we can see the motivation why for doing so. It's because if he has a child with Margaret Beaufort, for the rest of his life, he would have personal interest and control over her fortune, over her lands, over her inheritance. Edmund Tudor was 26 years old at this point. Margaret was just 12. It is very distasteful, and it certainly wasn't normal for the 1450s, any more than that would be normal today. It's a cruel act performed by Edmund Tudor, and in pregnancy, in labour, Margaret's life is despaired of, because in truth, she was still just a child when she was giving birth. Mm-hmm. But she does survive, her son survives, and he is given the name Henry after his half-uncle, the Lancastrian king, Henry VI. I think we just need to reflect upon why, as well, Margaret was given to Edmund Tudor. I think there's something to be said about what Henry VI was planning, because in 1452, after several years of marriage, Henry VI still doesn't have an heir. Mm-hmm. He has no son with Margaret of Anjou. And there are two senior nobles who are coming to clashes at this time. And that is Richard, the Duke of York, and that is Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, both of whom have claims to the English throne. They enter a blood feud, and it's often overlooked whether part of their feuding was because they knew each man could potentially be next in line for the English crown. What Henry VI looks to do, I believe, is to create an alternative line of succession by merging his half-brother's bloodline, the Tudor bloodline, with the Beaufort bloodline. Because Margaret Beaufort is the senior claimant to the House of Beaufort. She has that claim to the throne vested in her veins. And I would suggest Henry VI is trying to merge two of his family's bloodlines into one. But we don't hear any more about it, because almost as soon as this marriage comes to fruition, very quickly, Henry VI does have a son with Margaret of Anjou. So this Tudor-Beaufort merging is put on the sidelines and is kind of forgotten about for the next 30 years.
And it's kind of good for Henry that it's forgotten about for a while, because there are so many people who want this throne at this moment. It's probably best that he's forgotten about for a while. But I think that you're probably right, because with the combination of bloodlines, you have the Welsh royalty going very far back, plus you have the Valois blood, plus you have the Beaufort blood. Like, who could ask for anything more?
Yeah, and I think we have to be careful to suggest as well. There's no suggestion that this would have come to fruition, or that the Parliament and the Commons and the people of England would have supported this aspect. I think if Henry VI dies without a son, it would have been Richard, the Duke of York, rising to the fore. I don't think England would have accepted the Beauforts at this moment. They weren't necessarily a popular family. I think that the House of York, as did come to fruition during what became known as the Wars of the Roses, they would have pressed militarily their right. But it is an interesting dynamic taking place in the 1450s. All of this uncertainty, all of this feuding, weak kinship, for a time being no clear heir to the throne, it all, of course, erupts into civil war. And Henry Tudor is in a very precarious position as a child because he is closely related to the House of Lancaster on both sides of his family tree. No one's looking at him and saying, oh, this boy is one day going to be the King of England. I mean, that whole concept is absurd until Richard III becomes king, in fact. We need once and for all to get rid of this pervasive idea that Margaret Beaufort had a lifelong dream for Henry Tudor, his son, to become king. That is nothing more than the invention of one fiction writer in the last 20 years. Nobody was looking at Henry Tudor during the earlier phases of the Wars of the Roses as a prospective claimant to the English throne, because there quite simply were so many of them around who had the military backing to press their claims. But nonetheless, it was there in the background. Unfortunately for Henry, remarkably for Henry, in fact, over the next 30 years, everybody else falls by the wayside until he is, in effect, the last man standing to be given support against Richard III. But that's all later down the line anyway.
Yes. In the meantime, his father dies really, really early. Henry doesn't ever really get to know him because he's not in the picture. So how is Henry raised as a child?
Yeah, so, I mean, Edmund Tudor dies before Henry VII, Henry Tudor, is even born. So Henry Tudor is, in fact, the Earl of Richmond from birth. Many people all through history have simply ascribed Edmund Tudor's death to be plague. I think there's a very good case that he was murdered. I believe he was bumped off by the House of York. To learn more, please read my book where I lay out the case. But Henry Tudor is this little Lancastrian boy being brought up initially in Pembroke under the guardianship of his uncle Jasper Tudor. But when he's 4 years old, the Lancastrians are booted off the English throne and replaced by the House of York. His father, Edmund Tudor, is already dead. His grandfather, Owen Tudor, is executed aged 60, and Jasper Tudor, his uncle, is forced to flee abroad. So Henry is left isolated. And his wardship is sought by the new Yorkist King Edward IV to one of his closest supporters, somebody named William Herbert of Ragland. Now, if during the 15th century we've got all of these blood feuds taking place in England between the York and Lancaster, the Yorks and the Beauforts, the Yorks and everybody, in Wales we have a blood feud that's between the Herbert family and the Tudor family. They are the two main families vying for supremacy in Wales at this time. The Herberts have risen, the Tudors have fallen, and Henry Tudor is sold to the Herberts. Now, he would claim the next 10 years of his life, when he's being brought up by the Herberts at Ragland Castle, he lived a life akin to that of a prisoner. He was a fugitive. But the truth is, this is the only stable period in Henry Tudor's childhood. He has a good upbringing. He is taught mathematics, algebra. He's taught how to learn how to read and write. He's taught the basics of warfare. And he's also, for the first time, exposed to his Welsh ancestry, because Ragland is the greatest Welsh cultural hub there is during this period. So it is at Ragland that he becomes aware of the Welsh language, Welsh mythology, Welsh folklore, and his lineage is always being extolled by the poets. They're telling him, you are descended from Cadwallader, you are descended from King Arthur. We know that Henry is listening because he is arguably one of the cleverest kings of England that ever was, a very shrewd and intelligent and wise adult. Of course, he must have been quite a precocious young man and boy as well. He takes all of this in because this is information that he is going to use later on down the line. He has a very Welsh upbringing at Ragland, and he's in fact there until he's 14 years old. So this claim that Henry Tudor did not know Wales does not stand up to any scrutiny. He was born and bred in Wales, around Welshmen, around Welsh bards, around the Welsh culture, until he was 14 years old.
Right. And this is something that you can see, as you've traced in your book, comes back up in later life. He really enjoys all of the things that he grew up with, the music and the poems, and all of those things come back around. So when he's 14, things change for him again. The Wheel of Fortune is always turning, Henry. What happens around that moment?
Very briefly, we know that the Lancastrians, well, first of all, I should say, William Herbert is executed in 1469, trying to fend off the rebellion of Warwick the Kingmaker and George, Duke of Clarence. So Herbert is executed in 1469. In 1470, the Lancastrians come back to the English throne, and Henry is reunited with his uncle Jasper. And then just 8 months later, in the spring of 1471, the Yorkists sweep conclusively back to power by winning the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. It's the Wars of the Roses, the crown is being passed back and forth like pass the parcel. Mm-hmm. But in 1471, in May, the Yorkists have won. And what Edward IV looks to do is he looks to prevent these dynastic wars from restarting by cutting the head off the Lancastrian snake. By the end of May 1471, Henry VI is dead. His son, Prince Edward, is dead, and possibly the next two in line for the throne on that side of the family tree, the Beaufort brothers, John and Edmund, are also killed. These are all close relations to young Henry Tudor. Now, Henry Tudor does not make it to the Battle of Tewkesbury because he and his uncle Jasper are held up, for reasons we're not sure, about 20 or 30 miles away. And this arguably saves their life. But whilst they're waiting at Chepstow, trying to work out what to do, a Yorkish soldier comes out of nowhere and tries to capture them and kill them, probably sent by Edward IV to tie up any loose ends. Jasper Tudor is able to kill this would-be assassin, and he grabs his young nephew, and they ride hard through South Wales until they reach Tenby. Now, Tenby is a small but gorgeous town on the Welsh coast. It is Jasper's town, and the Tudors use some underground tunnels to get to a boat that's waiting for them in the harbour. Together, the Tudors sail out into the sea, and they begin Henry Tudor's 14 years in exile, away from everything that he knew. If they do not get on that small boat, they would have been killed by the Yorkists, because Jasper Tudor is a very ardent and well-known Lancastrian leader, but Henry Tudor, through his mother, has got that Beaufort blood in his veins. Again, there are many people with stronger claims to the throne than Henry Tudor, but that is a complication that Edward IV does not want to have. But fortunately, Henry Tudor is able to get out of England and Wales, and he heads on over across the Channel, where he spends the next 14 years loitering, really, kept a prisoner of primarily the Duke of Brittany, and then later on the Crown of France. But he is in effect loitering for 14 years, essentially waiting for the moment that the Bretons will finally make that deal with the English and turn him over. He's stuck in limbo. His life is dangling in the balance with every negotiation that Edward IV has with the Duke of Brittany. But in 1483, something remarkable happens.
You're just going to leave it right there. Well, I was going to say surprising things are happening in the background, because his mother, who he's barely talked to, is still working in the background. And she is just about to get her son back over the channel when everything falls apart. So tell us what happens.
Yeah, so Margaret Beaufort is reconciled to the Yorkist regime throughout the 1470s because, in truth, the Wars of the Roses are over. 1471, the Wars of the Roses have come to an end. The White Rose has won. The Yorkists are successful. The Lancastrians are gone. They've been wiped out. So Margaret Beaufort, like most other former Lancastrians during this period, they just get on with their daily lives and they try to make the best of it. And she does grow close to the Yorkist regime. And she is pressing Edward IV constantly to let her son come home because he is her sole heir. You know, Henry Tudor is the Earl of Richmond through his father, but through his mother, he stands to inherit incredible wealth from those Beaufort land and estates. Margaret Beaufort wants her only boy back for him to take over, you know, the family business.
Mm-hmm.
But Edward IV is having none of it. For throughout the 1470s, he's having none of it. He does try to get his hands on Henry Tudor multiple times, but that's to almost certainly have him executed, until we reach 1482, when Edward IV has grown, well, he's grown corpulent with success, hasn't he? He is comfortable on the throne. He has defeated all of his rivals. He has the heir on the spare. I mean, for people who've watched Game of Thrones, he's Robert Baratheon. He is just enjoying his success, and he's realised, I have nothing to fear anymore. The dynasty is secure for generations to come. So, okay, Margaret Beaufort, I will allow your son to come home. And together they draft a pardon. And this pardon is written on the back of the very patent that created Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, in the first place. And it's a draft pardon saying Henry Tudor can come home. He can inherit his Beaufort lands as long as he bends the knee and accepts, I am his king. Edward IV is his king. And who knows, he may even be granted one of the York daughters as his bride. So things are looking up for Margaret Beaufort at this period. She's just about to get confirmation that her son can come home. And Edward IV does something really stupid and he goes and dies aged just 40. And suddenly all of Margaret Beaufort's plans are thrown up in the air. Now, of course, I'm perhaps not going to try and dwell on this too much, but Edward IV has left behind a 12-year-old son and a 9-year-old spare, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury. 78 days after their father's death, neither of those boys are crowned King of England. The person who is crowned the next King of England is their uncle, Richard III. Now, the day before his coronation, Margaret Beaufort has a private meeting with Richard III. Officially, this meeting is about a Beaufort family debt that she is owed from one of the French dukes, from the Duke of Orleans. And she is asking Richard III, as her king, will he help intercede on behalf of this family debt? You know, Richard has to be a good lord. That's his job. But nobody can convince me that during that meeting, Margaret Beaufort has put it to Richard, what about my son? Mm-hmm. Your brother Edward IV had this pardon ready to go, allowing my son, who is now 26 years old, to finally come home and become Earl of Richmond. And I would suggest Richard said, no, do not be stupid, Margaret. which is a fair answer from his point of view. Whether you believe he usurped the throne or whether you believe he was given it rightfully, Richard is in a weak position at this moment and he can't have any complications coming home or any Lancastrians coming home to cause issues. So I believe he said no because very shortly thereafter, Margaret Beaufort goes straight to work, conniving and conspiring to bring Richard down. And I think that is the moment. I think it's Richard saying Henry Tudor cannot come home that pushes Margaret into open rebellion.
Yes, well, as you say, there's no one looking at Henry Tudor to be the king until Richard III takes the throne. And then all of a sudden, everyone's eyes start looking across the channel. But even then, they're not sure that Henry is going to be the best option. But together, Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen, they're working behind the scenes. And it seems to be that, I think, that you're gesturing towards in your book, that turns the tide, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Tudors later wrote history how they wanted a lot of the story to be told, obviously. And the story that's been told is that, you know, at this moment, Henry Tudor is proposed to be the next King of England, and he comes back to rescue England from tyranny. But I would suggest in 1483, first and foremost, all of the people who were looking to rebel against Richard III, and there's a sizable amount of them, because not everyone agreed with what he did. You know, he had alienated half of the Yorkist support and caused half of that Yorkist support to look for conspiracies to bring him down. Half of that support, they now look for another leader. And I would suggest, and contemporary records suggest, that is the Duke of Buckingham. Now, we don't know why the Duke of Buckingham rebelled from Richard III's side. Ambition is likely to be the key scenario because he is Richard III's key ally. And he is given incredible power and influence under Richard's reign. He is effectively made the number 2 in the kingdom. Why would you rebel from a position of number 2 unless it is to be number 1? Mm-hmm. You certainly are not rebelling to put a junior cousin you don't know in Henry Tudor on the English throne. The Duke of Buckingham had a very strong claim to the throne. He was descended 3 times over from Edward III, and in fact, his Beaufort claim to the throne, because he was descended from the Beauforts, was stronger than Henry Tudor's. There is very good reason why, when Buckingham's rebellion collapses in 1483, Richard III officially calls it Buckingham's conspiracy. 1483, all of the conspiracies are about putting Buckingham on the English throne, and Henry Tudor is, of course, a very important part of that, in that he's also going to invade at the same time for this pincer movement on Richard III. But Buckingham's an idiot. He messes it all up and he gets his head chopped off. And the truth is, the earliest that I've been able to find any reference whatsoever to Henry Tudor being a King of England is the 3rd of November, 1483. And by this point, the princes in the Tower are presumed by many people to have been killed, so they are out of the way. And Buckingham has been executed. Buckingham was executed on the 2nd of November, 1483, in Salisbury. The very next day, a group of rebels, for the first time, mention they are going abroad to raise an alternative king. And these rebels end up at the court of Henry Tudor in Brittany. And we come to Christmas Day, 1483, where Henry Tudor pledges before these English rebels that he will marry Elizabeth of York. So I will say the earliest Henry Tudor is put forward as a King of England is after Richard III has become king. And I would in fact place it not until November 1483, not earlier in the summer, as the Tudors would later write, because they're not obviously going to go back later on and say, well, no, there was the Duke of Buckingham first, because guess what? He has a son living at the court of Henry VII and Henry VIII, and he famously later gets his head cut off by Henry VIII as well. So I think history was rewritten a little bit there.
I mean, with the Tudors, everything is rewritten a little bit, either for them or against them. There's all sorts of stuff that's being thrown around, and you really do have to do some detective work. Okay, so Henry does not make it across the New Year's Day that's following this announcement. It takes him a while, but he gathers support and he comes back and he meets Richard III on the battlefield at Bosworth. What do you think Henry is thinking at this moment? Do you think that he believes that this is going to work? I mean, the later writers are like, yeah, he was all in. What do you think Henry's thinking as he's lacing up for Bosworth?
I think the odds are so stacked against him. There's no way that this invasion campaign should be successful. His army is weak. It is primarily French mercenaries. It is around 400 to 500 English rebels and a handful of Scots who have come along for a fight. He lands in Wales to boost his numbers, and he does get around 2,000 to 3,000 more men. But it's a weak army that is going up against Richard III. Now, famously, the Stanleys are a third army at Bosworth, and they do ultimately intercede on Henry's side. I would suggest that deal was always known. I think the Stanleys were always going to come in on Henry's side. They just couldn't make their move earlier. But nonetheless, you're going up against the King of England with all of the might and the numbers and the location that he has. Henry, at best, as we say in boxing, he had a puncher's chance. He's got a slight chance, but he shouldn't have won that day. If I was to put myself into his frame of mind, I would believe he had nothing going for himself abroad. He was 28 years old. On at least a few occasions, he was faced with being arrested and turned over to the English for execution. It was just a matter of time before diplomacy worked against him and he was going to be killed. I think this is his one and only throw of the dice, and I think he goes for it. I would love to know whether he is able to exploit and use all of this pumping out of Welsh political propaganda in poetry that says that he is the son of prophecy, that says that he is the chosen Messiah. I wonder if he uses this to give himself some motivation. I mean, you know, I would listen to the Rocky soundtrack today to build myself up before a big event. I wonder if Henry is using a lot of this to not only galvanise himself as well, to galvanise the support around him. Of course, the majority of that support is Welshmen, who I believe are really buying into this concept of him being the Messiah, and Frenchmen who are there for the coin. Things don't look good for Henry, at kick-off at Bosworth battlefield. It's a remarkable scenario, if anything, and it's a remarkable outcome that he does become King of England. It's a remarkable story.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think that you're right. It probably does not hurt that he lands in Wales and that he has people in his ear being like, you can do this. You got this. You got this. As he's going there, because he is up against a formidable opponent. And this is the moment in your book where you are your kindest to Richard III. I think people unfairly say that you hate Richard. You don't hate Richard. And this is where you say very nice things about how courageous Richard III was in this battle. So, okay, I will give you a moment here. Tell us what you think about Richard III.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. I think I do get a lot of grief and a lot of misunderstanding of where I stand on Richard. The truth is, I am ambivalent about Richard III as a person, as a king, which is a lot better, a lot more positive than people who believe that I have some weird hatred or grudge against him. I mean, this is a guy who lived 500 years ago. I find Henry VII very interesting, but these are people who we should not overly fall into the traps of fandom about. You know, we are trying to assess these people's characters. And of course, every historian has a certain bias towards the subject that they do study because we're human beings. You know, we're not going to be studying people and periods that don't interest us for one way or the other. Mm-hmm. But Richard III, I mean, I view him as wasted potential, I would say. I think Ricardians really over-egg the pudding when it comes to Richard III in claiming that he was a good king and a remarkable king. He reigned for just 2 years and he did just one parliament. Now, this one parliament did have some very good laws, but he's not producing these laws or seeing them through out of sheer selfless behaviour. There can be some earnest concepts of a care for justice for the people, but he's just taken the throne in a very controversial way, and he needs to be seen to be given the people what they want to keep them on side. Henry Tudor would do the same thing, in fact. Richard then dies. We don't know what king he would have been long term. If we look at any popular king throughout English history, they all, to keep on the sporting metaphors, they all lose the dressing room eventually. Edward III, an incredible 50-year reign, there was deep unhappiness towards the end of his reign with circumstances occurring around his court, the debts incurred from the war. You'll probably know far more about that than I will. Henry V, we know that Adam of Usk was bemoaning the tax burden towards the end of his lifetime. Henry VIII, an astonishingly popular king at the outset who grew unpopular and Henry Tudor, Henry VII, a 24-year reign that declined into avarice and financial greed, financial tyranny, and unpopularity towards the end. We can't say that Richard III would have bucked the trend and reigned for 30 years and have brought peace and prosperity to England forevermore. Richard III had great potential as a King of England. He arguably would have been a good King of England, and I think in many ways he was the right choice to be King of England in 1483 when we add in the wider context of increasing factional discord, the threat of the 100 Years' War looming and restarting. Richard was a far better king than having a child king. But, unfortunately, the way that he went about doing it upset enough people to open the door that somebody with a very good story could come in. And I do think that with Henry Tudor, a lot of people possibly thought they were going to get a puppet king, but the one that he proved was he was no puppet. So Richard III, wasted potential, could have been a good king. I don't think he's a monster in any way, shape or form. I'm in fact on record as saying, rather bizarrely, that I do think he murdered the Princes of the Tower because it is the logical thing to do in 1483, and quite frankly, it was the right decision to do, which always gets me quite a few weird looks when I say that at talks. But, this is the medieval period. This is a time of ruthless actions taken in the interest of what we would now understand to be national security. It's unpalatable, but, this is the period that we study, that we love to look into. I don't like Richard III as a character, but I don't hate him either. As I say, I'm fairly ambivalent to him. But of course, I can't study my period without assessing what comes before. So it's unwarranted to expect that I should only begin my studies and my interest on the evening of the 22nd of August, 1485.
Mm-hmm. Well, and somebody always has to be on the Tudor side when they bring up the princes in the tower, and it's you. It's always you. All right. So we've been talking about this for, longer than I usually do because this is so interesting, but we probably should wrap it up. So you actually conclude your book at this moment at the coronation of Henry Tudor. He's marrying Elizabeth of York. He's uniting the two houses. Why do you end this book here?
Because I told the rest of the story in a previous book. I joke, but that kind of is the truth in many ways. I wrote Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders, which came out in 2020, and that obviously it touches on briefly Henry's route to Bosworth, but then it's the story of his reign. This particular book, The Son of Prophecy, obviously I've run out of space to continue it. Unfortunately, we as authors, we do have tight word limits, but I've covered the story as it is. This is the story of the Tudors, but before they become the Tudors. Everything that follows afterwards is well-trodden ground. Everybody knows the story that comes later. The Six Wives, the Spanish Armada, the various rebellions, the Virgin Queen. I'm trying to give people an insight into where this dynasty came from in the first place. You can't look at the house of Tudor without studying the foundations. And this is the foundations. And Bosworth is the end of that family cycle and the start of a new one.
Well, I think that this is a wonderful look at not only the Tudor dynasty and its foundations, but also all of that forgotten Welsh history. We're always hearing there's a rebellion here and there and everywhere, and you're actually explaining to us how these rebellions come up. And I think it's something that is so important, and especially in popular history, we don't often see a lot of the Welsh side when it's so important to this entire period. So I loved your book. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for being on the podcast to talk about it.
Thank you for giving me another opportunity to extol the virtues of what I call the Welsh Tudors.
To find out more about Nathen's work, you can visit his Substack at nathenamin.substack.com. That's Nathen with an E. His new book is Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey, hey. So we decided to take a look at tariffs in the Middle Ages.
Very timely.
Well, for no particular reason. Hey, why not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, it really was a major source of revenue back in medieval times. For medieval rulers, it was one of the ways they earned money, but it really didn't have many other economic reasons for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like slightly, but usually it was just a way to fleece merchants.
Not to put too fine a point on it.
Yeah, there could be tariffs on imports, exports, just passing through. It was all very interesting. It was a huge system of any kind of ruler trying to put on tariffs and tolls. I read this one particularly funny part where if you were going down the Rhine River in 1250 with your goods, if you went from Mainz to Cologne, which is like 180 kilometers along the river, you'd have to go through 12 different tolls.
Wow.
So it is not surprising that there was actual wars fought to get rid of bad tolls.
Yes. I mean, it's something that is not new to world economy.
So take a look at that piece. It was a lot of fun. It makes me feel a little better about today.
All right.
So we have that. Plus, we have other pieces. Loris Chevalier has a great piece on why the Inquisition did not persecute werewolves.
Okay.
Yeah. And also Richard Abels takes a look at the Council of Whitby and the politics of early modern England. So always fun there.
Nice. A nice wide range of things as usual.
Yeah. Also, we have a little piece on the Council of Nicaea. It's at 1700th anniversary. So
Wow.
people are talking about it again.
Mm-hmm. Everything old is new again, right?
Indeed, indeed. So we have all that and much, much more on the site.
Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and telling us all about it.
Thanks.
In times like these, it's important to have reliable information easily available to the public. So massive thanks to each and every one of you whose support makes my mission possible. Your Patreon donations are what allow this podcast to continue. So if you're a patron, feel free to pat yourself on the back for your part in making the world a better informed place. If Patreon is currently a stretch, rest assured that letting the ads play through without skipping them is also a contribution, as is spreading the word. But if you're able to kick in $1 or $2 to keep the medieval goodness coming, please visit patreon.com/medievalists to get started. For everything from Wales to Wales, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening and have yourself an awesome day.